All right, so we're back here for part 2. Our transmission's prepped and ready to go. We made sure our clutch and flywheel assembly is ready to go. So quick tips before we plug this guy back in. Make sure in the service manual you know where to put grease in the correct spots. Another insider tip is put a little bit of grease on the face of this throwout bearing. And this is important because if you can see these wear marks on the fingers of the pressure plate, this is where the throwout bearing will ride and press in and out against the pressure plate, and without that grease these fingers will wear prematurely, and which necessitates a premature clutch and pressure plate replacement. Another thing you want to do, there's 2 dowel pins on the engine side. You want to put some anti-seize on both of these dowel pins. Not only does that ease in transmission installation, but also the next time this has got to come out, you won't be fighting to remove the trans off of these dowel pins. All right, so we're gonna lift this guy up close, try to get these 2 bottom bolts lined up on these 2 studs, and once we're close we'll come back. All right, got the bell housing lined up on these studs. We're getting really close. Again, the purpose of that pull jack, you want to ensure that the engine and the trans are all on the same plane, because if one of them crooked as compared to the other one, these 2 are not gonna line up. So we're at this point. You see, if I try to push any more, it doesn't really want to go in the rest of the way to the engine. So I know my input splines are inside the clutch disc, because if I try to turn, the trans doesn't turn, so I know the splines are engaged. When you're at this point, you absolutely do not want to put in a bolt and try to draw the trans inside. You want to get this ideally flush with the engine. So a couple things you need to make sure. Check the gap right here. Is it too big on top or too big on bottom? You may need to adjust either the transmission position or the tilt of the engine. Also, if you feel like the input splines aren't engaging, you can actually pull this back into gear. Now the output should actually rotate the input shaft. And you can turn the output to try to get the input shaft splines to line up with the clutch disc. Alright, so you guys probably saw with a little bit of adjustment on the back of the trans, and then a little bit of shaking of the tail shaft to get this guy in here. It's pretty much flush, so I'm comfortable putting in my bell housing bolts. It's not always this easy. Sometimes I'll put a bell housing bolt, 1 on each side, and just leave it partially threaded like this, and so I can shake the trans back and forth and it'll bump up against the head of these bolts and give you a little more like leverage to get this guy seated. I'm gonna put my starter in there and get this hand tight. The reason I don't want to tighten this down all the way is because sometimes you tighten this down and then the top hole is not going to line up. So we'll just hand thread this first. We'll do 1, 2, 3, and then 4, 5. 4 and 5 are the access cover. So we'll get those 5 bell housing bolts, and then we'll get the other parts underneath the body installed. All right, so really quick, a dab of blue Loctite on all the bell housing hardware, because just from the frequency and vibration, I've had these bolts back out before. All right, got my 5 bell housing bolts in. The bottom bolt for the starters just hand tight, because again, we want to fully tighten the top one first, make sure that hole lines up before we tighten this guy all the way. This also shares the ground wire for the chassis, and you can see how this is positioned so that when this bolt gets tightened, this ear at the end hits up against the starter so this wire harness doesn't get twisted. So this position. We're getting ready to put these shifter parts back in. I just lowered the jack a little bit. We're probably gonna have to move this side to side to get clearance to put in these guys, but yeah, you can grease or spray some stuff on these guys, help them go in a little bit easier. All right, getting ready to put the drive shaft in. You want to make sure to get some gear oil and just lightly lubricate this before it goes in the seal, and then also the inside of this where the output goes into the splines. Then I'm actually just gonna loosely put in the 2 center bearing bolts and then tighten the diff side all the way first. The reason we do that is we want to make sure that this guy's fully bolted up, not like biased one way or the other, so we're not putting stress on the center bearing. So just to recap, torque those to spec first, and then when this is in a neutral position, this one last. So we'll do that right now. Loctite on these guys also. Alright, helps if you have a friend to hold the back half of this. So I'm just gonna lightly put on those 2 center bearing bolts. Alright, so I got this flush, got my 4 bolts in there. Remember our paint pen mark to make sure these 2 are indexed correctly together. 55 foot-pounds is the torque spec for these drive shaft bolts. It's really difficult to fit a torque wrench in here, so my setup is my snap-on torque wrench with a thin head, and this will be my setup, and then a box end wrench on both sides. Alright, and then I'll do like crisscross or like opposing bolts to make sure that this flange gets torqued down centered onto the rear diff flange. Got all 4 of these torqued. I'm going to go one more time around, and then we'll turn this, make sure our center bearing's centered in like a neutral spot, and then we'll torque down those 2 bolts to spec. Torque these 2 down to spec. Before we put in the rest of the exhaust, we're actually going to go up and finish up the top of the car. Totally forgot. Now's actually a good time to fill up the transmission with your desired fluid. Fill up the trans after you put this in, and ask me how I know. If you don't put in the drive shaft in first and fill up the trans, it'll actually spill out through this way. So how difficult this thing was to unthread out, you could probably tell that somebody reused this and cranked down on this thing multiple times. So we're putting new crush washers on these guys just so that doesn't happen, that the threads in the case don't get messed up like this. Alright, so our transmission's filled, we're back on top of the car. We're going to put the 1 bell housing bolt for the starter and a little bit of Loctite on this guy. Once we put in this bolt, we're gonna lift the car back up, tighten down our bottom bolt, and then get the rest of the exhaust back in there. Back under the car, you want to put some anti-seize on these studs, and I'll just use a box end wrench to tighten down these. First thing I'll do is hang the pipe on the exhaust hanger, and that way you can move it around and this thing the exhaust shouldn't fall down. The reason I tighten the starter in that order is because probably you're gonna do all the stuff on top, and then in the end you're gonna forget to tighten down that bolt. So yeah, starter's good to go. Let's get the rest of the car back together, exhaust, and then we'll put on our 2 under trays. We'll tighten down the center bolt last, so that this thing stays in like a relaxed position. Cool. We'll put the under trays on, and then we'll go back to the top of the car. Alright, so quick tip about these under trays. I'll actually hand thread every single one of these fasteners first before I gun down any one of these, because what usually happens is you gun down one and then another one of these holes doesn't line up anymore. So you can see there isn't much side to side slop, so you kind of got to get every single hole dead on. So don't try to just jam a bolt in there if one of the holes doesn't line up. Alright, we're back on top of the car, home stretch. You shouldn't have to lift up the car again unless you drop one of your tools or a nut down there, so don't do that. So we're gonna put everything back together in reverse order. I'll probably put on the starter harness first, take care of this side, and then 2 bolts for the slave cylinder. Your clutch fork, you want to put a dab of grease where the clutch slave cylinder pushes against the fork, the clutch slave rod right there. Everything mechanically should be hooked up. We are ready to start. Before we start, I want to do a few sanity checks. So does the shifter go into every gear? When I press the clutch pedal, how does it feel? Clutch pedal feels good. It comes back up. There's a firm feeling. There's no weird noises when I press the clutch pedal. Does this go into every gear? Reverse. There's a lockout for reverse. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So if any of these don't check out, you should go back under the car and check out what's wrong. But so far so good. So alright, so before we even start the car, there's a couple weird Subaru things that you should be aware of. So key on, I'm gonna wait like 5 seconds. Okay, cool. And every time you disconnect the battery on a modern Subaru, you gotta wait this 5 seconds because it's the throttle body that has to recalibrate. Some of you guys probably experienced when you connect the battery back up after disconnecting the battery and you try to crank it first fire, it'll crank for a really long time and then finally it'll fire. So that's the factory procedure. After you connect back the battery, 5 seconds, key on, wait. So now we're ready to start. I want to clutch in, start, clutch out, and then listen for any weird noises. If there's a weird noise, shut the car off. So yeah, sounds good. Clutch in and out, no weirdo noises. So about this time, we'll double check everything and then we're ready to road test. Just got back from our road test. Some things to look out for. Does the clutch work at all speeds? Take it on the highway. Does anything weird happen? Do all your up and down shifts work? Is there any crunching in one gear, all gears? Or hopefully, like in this case, the car drove pleasantly fine. I wish they were all like this. Couple things to note: if you're working on the customer's car, make sure to reset their clock. Respect the customer and be a professional. Once in a while on modern Subarus, you'll have a low idle. It's pretty common on boxer engines for the throttle body to get really dirty inside. So disconnecting the battery and having a really low idle, like the car wants to stall, that's a really common indicator of you need to clean the throttle body. After you clean the throttle body, the Subaru factory procedure is actually just to let the car idle for 15 minutes and then the throttle body will naturally learn where it should stay open to achieve the target idle speed. This is Autohaus Z from CM Autohaus in Fremont, California. If you have any questions, any tips, any advice for me on future videos, anything else you want to see, please leave a comment below. Thank you guys so much for watching.